Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is our monthly Healthy Planet Action Coalition meeting. The HPAC, for those of you who are new to us, has been in operation for a bit over a year now. And basically our philosophy and approach is that we believe the climate and the planet can be restored to a safer climate through a three-part set of approaches. And those three parts are also parallel to what Shaun and the folks at the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge advocate. So we're delighted. I'll turn it over to Robert in a minute to have this discussion today. Just a couple quick announcements. I sent a note out to the HPAC folks. If you're on Twitter, we'd love to have you basically follow our Twitter account at Planet Coalition. We'll put that in the chat. We've already had 4 or 5 people since I first sent out the note do that. We also will be announcing the steering circle, a proposal to have a series of working papers prepared by our members and participants. We'll send out more information about that, but we're excited about that. We also encourage you to let us know. We haven't yet developed our programs for 2023. Your ideas on speakers, topics, etc. Please let us know at the steering circle. And as Suzanne said, or if you got here late, if you're new and you want to be on our mailing list or just want to say hello and tell us who you are, please put your introductory material and a bit about who you are in the chat. And with that, I simply want to say that I'm really thrilled that we have Shaun here today. I was at a lecture in London during Climate Week in 2019, where I had a chance to meet Sir David King afterwards, and he had mentioned about the center being created sometime in the future in this talk. And so I asked him afterwards, well, I was really excited. When would this get in operation? And he gave me kind of a wry smile and said, well, as soon as we raise 50 million pounds. And he said, don't ask me when that'll be. But so I don't know if you've raised 50 million pounds or not, but you're in operation, doing great work. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Robert is I got an email a few minutes ago from someone who unfortunately couldn't attend today, but he wanted me to ask, I'll take my role as a convener here, ask you a question, Shaun. So I will start off. And the question is, will you be once again playing the trumpet at the King's College Choir this Christmas? So you can answer that now or later as part of your program, presentation. But anyway, he was eager that question be asked of you. So with that, I'm really thrilled that you're here today, Shaun, and I'll turn it over to Robert, who will be moderating the rest of the program.
Thanks very much, Herb, and thank you, Shaun, for taking the time to update us on the Cambridge Centre. And I'll just briefly say that it's such a great pleasure to have you with us, and have really appreciated hearing the work of the Centre and engaging with you. And as mentioned in the outline, the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge is the leading academic institution in the world focused on what we in the Healthy Planet Action Coalition call the Climate Triad: reducing emissions, removing greenhouse gases, and refreezing the poles. And it's a challenging topic, and we really welcome the opportunity to hear from you now. So, Shaun, please.
Well, great, Robert, and thank you everybody for coming. It's really lovely to see you all. So 2 things first. My very dear colleague, Hugh Hunt, I was hoping would be able to join us today, but actually he's at AGU in Chicago. And John Nissen, I see you're on the call. I thought you might be in Chicago as well. So were you there for part of it? Are you back, or are you still there? You're on mute, John.
I'm virtually there.
Okay, so you're a virtual attendee.
I'm sitting in Bath, pretending I'm in Chicago.
Well, apparently it's rather wet there, so perhaps you're wherever you are, it might be better. And the second thing is, in answer to the question I think was probably posed by Herbert, I'm not actually playing in King's College Chapel on Christmas Day this year. I did a couple of years ago, and I many years ago when Herbert heard me, I was actually playing in the, I think it was the Advent Carol service with the late Her Majesty the Queen, and I think Prince Philip were there in attendance as well. So I think that's why Herbert was asking. So that's a sideline of mine. It's my a hobby, and a few of us say it was a hobby that got out of control. We enjoy sort of playing to a reasonably good standard. Right. So look, today I thought I'd give you an update on where we are at the Centre for Climate Repair. You were very gracious in some of your remarks, Robert. Yes, I'm the director of the Centre for Climate Repair, and I see us as just one of a number of organisations in the world really trying to do what we can to actually tackle climate change. We do have a sort of, I think, a fairly clear strategy, but there are many organizations doing amazing work, and I see Suds is on the call. He and I, have really enjoyed, and I spent time in the summer, for example, over at the Gordon conference, and met Shaun, one of Suds' colleagues. There's incredible work going in other organizations as well, and it's just wonderful to be part of basically a global ecosystem doing what we can to try and figure out ways of tackling climate change. So I'm going to just share some materials, if that's okay. I'm going to just see if I can share my screen. Oops, Robert or Herb, it's giving me this lovely message, host disabled, participant screen sharing. Is there any way that you might allow me to share some visual aids? If not, I could just talk to it, but people might find it a bit easier if I did use the visual aids.
I've given you the authority to share now, Shaun.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so here we go. So I'm hoping that many of you are familiar with the strategy that has been developed by the Centre for Climate Repair. We call it the 3 R's, and actually the 3 R's, they're all important for us to get our head around, and they operate at different timescales. So it's fairly obvious that we need to do whatever we can to have serious, deep and rapid emissions reduction. I don't need to rehearse the arguments, but it's taking rather too long to actually get in English we say our house in order, but of course it's our planet in order. We're still seeing emissions going up. So when we talk about emissions reduction, we've got to get to a position where then call it the net emissions if you like, but the emissions are therefore not going to be increasing. But we fully endorse this, we fully support it, and we actually have that as part of our strategy within the University of Cambridge. But we're fairly limited in what we can do, because in large part because there's so much going on elsewhere in the world. That we think that actually is just in large part a case of there's a lot to be done on deployment. There is some research that needs to be done, but there's a lot out there already that frankly just needs to happen. The second R is greenhouse gas removal at scale. Here we are fairly active, and the reason being is that once you've tried to turn the taps off running into the bath, the level is too high already, and the level is going to get higher. Therefore, we need to drain the bathtub of greenhouse gases. Therefore, we're going to need to figure out how we remove them at scale, and all of that's going to take rather some time. And we're very, very worried, therefore, about things like ice levels on Greenland, ice levels on Antarctica, actually the state of the Arctic in general. And our first priority is to look at what we can do to potentially refreeze the Arctic. We don't know how to do this yet. We do think it's an urgent thing that we need to be looking at as to ways that we might be able to do that. So those are our 3 R's of our strategy. And just as an example, there are lots of things that we could do to reduce emissions, obviously switching away from fossil fuels, so wind power, solar power, tidal power, hydro. The vectors are really important. So once you've electrified everything and moved away from, for example, using fossil fuels, electricity is your vector, and therefore we're going to need to see changes in our transportation systems as well as our industrial processes, whether it's cars, lorries with overhead cables and things like this, or even electric planes, or whether there's another vector, which is, are you using synthetic fuels and deriving those? Lots of work going on. The area that we do play in, and it's because of the two reasons, it's the area of buildings. So the two images on the middle and right of the bottom row, heat pumps, for example, in domestic buildings, and just looking at really low energy, ultra efficient non-domestic buildings. The reason why we play in that space is that about 40% of carbon emissions worldwide, in the developed world anyway, are associated with the built environment. And the second thing is actually is an area that I worked in for at least 15 years, looking at the built environment, technologies to reduce energy consumption. And actually many moons ago, I was in the geothermal industry and actually got into geothermal heat pumps as well. So it's just an area that the Centre for Climate Repair happens to have some area of expertise in, and it's a big contributor in terms of the problem, 40% of carbon emissions. So we are active in that area. But there are lots of other people doing amazing work looking at materials and things like this in reducing emissions. Where we spend most of our effort is looking at the removal of greenhouse gases and refreezing of the Arctic. So removal of greenhouse gases. The area that we have first of all looked at is indeed the area of methane, the second greenhouse gas. I would say the undersung greenhouse gas, and I know Daphne's on the call and thinks she would also argue that this is a really big problem that hasn't received the same level of attention that carbon dioxide has. When I say, in terms of it being a problem, it's responsible for about a third of warming over the last 10 years, for example. It's not a distant cousin, it's a close second. And we're looking at what we might be able to do with methane. And the area that we are looking at is exploring the role of catalysts in, frankly, just accelerating the oxidation of methane to carbon dioxide. You could go the full hog and say, right, we're going to oxidize it and then trap the carbon dioxide that you've then created. But first off, methane being so much more potent as a greenhouse gas. If you're going to look at methane levels in the atmosphere, clearly the first thing you should do is look at trying to stop it getting into the atmosphere. We park that in the reducing emissions area. So if you're going to go and bootstrap some technologies that capture methane or accelerate the oxidation of methane from point sources, whether they are cow sheds or whether you've got a leaking pipe somewhere or leaks where you really can't do anything about them leaking, but you can oxidize it. We'll call that greenhouse gas emissions reduction. But once it's in the atmosphere, we then consider this as a removal problem. Strictly speaking, it's not removing methane, it's converting it to a far less potent greenhouse gas, even though we don't like carbon dioxide, it's rather better than methane. And the two areas that we're looking at for catalysis are, first of all, the role of photocatalysts, and where you need lots of area to deal with a greenhouse gas, or you need lots of air moving over a limited surface area. And the latter one, which is what they do with, for example, direct air capture, they use fans to go and drive lots of air over small area contactors. That consumes a lot of energy, but effectively what you're doing is getting a lot of air to move over a limited surface area. Or you play the other game, which is where is there lots of surface area and you let just nature do the job for you in terms of getting the air in contact with that. So the two areas that we're looking at in the greenhouse gas removal space are looking at photocatalysts on the surface of the built environment, and what coatings might one be able to devise that would be of value to the built environment for purposes other than or in addition to methane oxidation. I think this is the real trick, where if somebody would want to pay for a coating because it increases the longevity or makes it easy to maintain, then there's value that someone will attribute to that said coating. And if it can also be a photocatalyst and therefore be used to accelerate the oxidation of methane. That's a co-benefit. So this is really thinking ahead to what kind of business models, what kind of applications you might be able to think about. So we're looking at coatings for the built environment, and answer first is that they already use titanium dioxide as a material on self-cleaning glass, which is used on skyscrapers and things like this. Titanium dioxide is a photocatalyst. We just don't think it hasn't been fine-tuned to be really great in many cases at oxidizing methane. So we're looking at what tweaks you might make to really improve the efficiency, the effectiveness of oxidizing methane, while still retaining the properties or even improving the properties for things like self-cleaning glass. But we're looking at not just glass, we're looking at other areas where you might just have a lower maintenance and lower cleaning costs or increased longevity for other building materials. So that's photocatalysis. The second area is looking at the area of ventilation in ducts. Now, part of the reason I sort of thought about this and got into this is that I was, for my sins, in the building industry, I was involved in ventilation, and hence I was involved in the sort of the last 2 or 3 years work on thinking about how we go and tackle COVID. So I was part of the UK government SAGE environmental modelling group and a whole bunch of others too, in terms of subgroups of the UK government. And I'm still on the World Health Organization special interest group or advisory group for ventilation and on COVID-19, although it's now 2022. Now, ventilation ducts, one of the techniques that was being suggested was using UV in ventilation ducts to actually knock out viruses, and it does. And when we looked at this, I started thinking about this as UV as a way of being the light source to then go and have photocatalysts in ventilation systems. But on reflection, I'm not sure that that is the answer. The reason being is that you still need a large area of the photocatalyst in the presence of the UV source, and you don't need that huge UV source in order to knock out the virus. So where we're thinking now is potentially looking at things like HEPA filters, which are the job of knocking out viruses, but then combining the HEPA filters, which really are in close contact, direct contact of all of the airflow moving through a duct, and what do you do to a HEPA filter in order to help oxidize the methane. And it may not be a photocatalyst, it might be an electrocatalyst where you put a charge across the filters themselves. They have the added advantages that the filters then also get changed every 6 months or every 4 months. So if they do degrade for some reason, they're being replaced for other reasons in terms of their effectiveness at knocking out viruses. So there's a maintenance checking facility, which is quite attractive. So we've got some funding from the Grantham Foundation, and we're working in collaboration with a researcher at the university in Gran Canaria, who is also got a visiting position at UCL in London. He's a photocatalyst expert. We've got another catalyst expert at the University of Cambridge, and they're having a lot of fun. That project is literally only just getting started. We've said the funding has been agreed, and we're currently recruiting for a postdoc in this area. So if any of you happen to know of candidates, it's on the website looking for candidates to help support that research endeavour. But I'm very excited about that particular project. It'll run for about 2 years, where we're going to be doing some lab studies and actually some engagement as well with some of the industry partners. So we're going to be talking with the likes of Pilkington and with who do the self-cleaning glass, that's NSG. And we're also going to be looking at some of the ventilation companies who provide filters and things like that, which is the industry that I'm more familiar with. So that's the first one on removal of greenhouse gases. The other area that we're really looking at is the role of the oceans, which is a very large, think of the oceans just as 70% of the world's surface area. And it's that area aspect of how do you go and get greenhouse gas removal going, thinking about the air exchange between the atmosphere and the sea. The oceans are, they're hallowed ground. They are incredibly precious ecosystems, but we have done a fantastic job at frankly destroying many of these. whether it's as a result of the whaling, whether it's as a result of dredging. I mean, when I grew up, come a winter storm, I grew up on the coast. There used to be kelp being washed up on the shore. Yes, it smelled for a few weeks and it was a bit unpleasant for the residents. That never happens anymore because we've just ripped out all of the kelp beds. Well, that's just we've got to restore these because they were providing precious, important ecosystems for marine life, as well as a function of taking carbon dioxide out of the water. Effectively carbon dioxide out of the water. Obviously, it wasn't carbon dioxide in itself, but carbonates. But as a result of that, we were then having an increase. We were having carbon dioxide coming from the atmosphere into the ocean to maintain the balance. By removing the kelp beds, that flux has disappeared, and therefore the oceans are simply not doing what they were doing and what they should be doing. And we're looking at whether we might be able to not only restore the coastal kelp systems, but also look at whether the deep ocean itself might be able to provide a resource where we grow kelp on rafts or buoys in order to then have an increased flux of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the water, and then having that kelp grow. It grows really fast, and having some of that frankly slough off to the deep ocean, and then be sequestered for at least hundreds of years, maybe not thousands of years, but depending on what happens to it, it might actually even mineralize and form a solid material on the bottom of the ocean. But certainly in terms of the immediate one is to try and get some of the carbon dioxide into the deep ocean through kelp as a source. There are also other benefits to growing kelp, is that you don't need to have it all slough off to the ocean. There are economic benefits for example, foods and other products, which some of the kelp could be used for. But clearly we don't want it all used for that, otherwise we haven't sequestered any carbon dioxide. The topic that Dave King is leading on is what we're calling marine biomass regeneration, which is where we're looking at the oceans, and as a result of what we've done regarding our whaling activity over the last 250 years, we've seen a depletion in a number of species to the extent of losing 99% of them. So blue whales, it's estimated, are at now 1% of their previous number. And this is a real problem because the whales themselves, clearly it's a terrible thing for the ecosystems, but the whales themselves, some of these baleen whales, they feed at depth and they defecate at the surface. It's kind of hard to defecate when you've got 500 meters of water on top of you. Your orifice is just not going to open. So, they defecate at the surface. And as a result of feeding at depth and defecating at the surface, they actually provide effectively the pump for nutrients to get from depth to the surface waters. And it's things like phytoplankton that need some of these the minerals in things like iron and things like this, which are not they're not sort of the growth of the phytoplankton itself, but they're necessary for the growth. As a result of the whales being taken out of the food chain, the whole ecosystem has collapsed in many of these cases. So what we're looking at and trying to explore is whether there is a way of getting the whale populations back. This isn't a 1 year, 2 year project. This is a multi-decadal challenge of getting the whale populations back. Because if the whale populations are back in their previous number, and who's to say that was even the right number? Maybe they were on the increase anyway. Maybe they should be even higher than they were previously. As a result of that, you then have an ecosystem. And there are two things that are of interest. One is the actual carbon stock in the living ecosystem, and then the flux itself, because obviously the ecosystem is a living thing, so therefore things live, things die, and therefore you get effectively carbon dioxide being sequestered at the bottom of the ocean. So that's the second ocean project that we're looking at, and we're working with other institutions around the world, the group in Goa who've done some initial trials out at sea, looking at the potential for rice husks as a way of providing artificial nutrients to go and get the whale populations back. It's still very early days in terms of this particular project, but when you run the numbers, it is possible that we might be able to see gigatons of carbon dioxide sequestration per year as a result of, this kind of activity over a few percent of the ocean every year. And then clearly you then wouldn't need to do it after the whale populations are back, because then the pump is then working properly. The third R is looking at refreezing of the Arctic, and the area that we are spending most of our effort on is marine cloud brightening, and we're working with people from around the world. In particular, we've obviously having a regular contact with Southern Cross University, but we are also in touch with the folks at Park, as I know Sud's on the call, and indeed Hugh only met, was it yesterday? I think it was Shaun from Park, and who Hugh and I spent a week with earlier in the summer, just looking at different ways that you might be able to generate the right droplet size for the creation of whiter clouds in the marine boundary layer. Fundamentally, that's what this idea is about, is whether the clouds that form, for example, can they be encouraged to be whiter than they really are, and as a result of giving them more cloud condensation nuclei of the right size, and therefore for a given moisture content, can you organize it so that you get more smaller droplets rather than fewer larger ones? But you don't want to go too far, have them too small, otherwise actually you then start to lose again in terms of the reflectiveness of the clouds, if you get more like Rayleigh scattering rather than it being a white cloud. So there appears to be sort of an optimal limited size range of droplets that you would like to explore. And the way of doing this is literally just generating sea spray from the back of a boat, as is shown on this photograph. The principle is fairly simple, but the engineering behind it and actually testing whether this is going to work or not beyond modeling is non-trivial. And we're fairly new to the game. As I started my remarks, we're one of just a number of organizations, and other organizations are doing amazing work. Armand's group has been doing this for 10 years, on a shoestring, and now getting a bit more funding, I think. But look, they're working very hard and generating some amazing insights. But we've got an engineering team here at Cambridge where actually they do know how to manufacture things, and we've got this sort of microfabrication facility here where we're looking at some different nozzle generation or nozzle techniques, droplet generation techniques, which may or may not work, but we've got to try them to see whether we can overcome issues, for example, to do with fouling, biofouling, and whether we can get the energy needed for a certain droplet size really down, because at the moment the kind of energy that's being used in some of the field trials right now seems to be rather too high for it to be scalable. So we've got to get the energy down in order to deliver a scalable solution. And then the other area in the Refreeze project that we are looking at, which is actually closer to Seb's area, which is looking at whether we might be able to explore, well, we can definitely explore whether we can actually get more ice to grow in the winter. And the idea being is that as ice grows on the top of the Arctic Sea, the rate at which ice forms decreases, because the ice itself forms an insulating layer, and as the ice is forming from the bottom. And therefore, one idea would be to scoop up the ice after it's formed for a certain bit, pile it up, and then expose more open water to the Arctic winter air, and then have a higher rate of freezing. An alternative is that actually you just pump the water onto the top of the ice, but now you're bringing salt water onto the top of the ice. So although in principle it looks as if we're going to be able to create more ice during the winter, what we're doing is potentially creating more salty ice. And therefore, there's a bigger question also, which is that the daftest thing ever? In other words, have you made things worse? So this is a research project that we are looking at. We've been working the freezers at Trinity College thus far, but we're going to be doing our own sort of experiments this year, not just in chest freezers, rather than working in food freezers. Although we will have access. I think now in the Department of Applied Maths, their walk-in freezer has been out of action for a while, but I was only speaking with the head of the lab there last week, and it looks like that's coming back into operation as a result of actually a further understanding of the regulations regarding refrigerant that was preventing that freezer from being operated. But it's an exciting project. You know, looking at the numbers, you know, they're all big numbers when you get to sort of look at how we're going to make a difference to the planet, whether it's greenhouse gas removal and the gigatons. These are large projects, or whether it's actually looking at making a dent by trying to, you know, have cooling of 1 degree, 2 degrees centigrade. These are large numbers of pumps and ice volcanoes, or large numbers of vessels being used for marine cloud brightening. And the last area I wanted to share with you is that I've talked all about, so I'm going to call it the physical sciences. It's clearly physical and biological sciences so far. The area of engaging the wider public, it's not just the policymakers, but actually the wider public, is really, really important. And we can do that with local communities. And you know, we are just starting in this area right now, but we have been doing some work, frankly, just trying to build our understanding of the public's views. You could say everyone talks, well, people used to talk about the public understanding of science, and it's, you know, it's not a term that's welcomed now in the social sciences. However, what is welcomed is our understanding of the public's views of sciences, and I think that's actually where we are right now. So this work is looking at doing some analysis on things like hashtag geoengineering on Twitter, to see whether we can get an understanding of who's saying what else are they talking about, what are the correlations between those who are expressing negative views on, let's say, the term geoengineering, what else are they talking about, and just to actually shed some light on this. And that research, we're in the process of, well, it's been written up, it's been submitted for publication, and now we're just going through some reviews. In other words, it's received positive reviews, and we're now looking at sort of just finalizing that, so that hopefully that will get published in the first half of 2023. But it's really interesting to try and sort of just shed light on some of the, you know, they are controversial topics, some of the things that we're talking about, Herb and Robert, but actually shedding light, well, why are they controversial? Who says they're controversial? Where are those voices? Who are they? I think it's just really illuminating, casting no judgment on this, just trying to shed light on this and find out what else people are talking about. And with that, I thought I would then open the floor to some questions, Robert.
Thank you very much, Shaun. That was superb. We have an hour or so, which is great for conversation. And so I'll invite people to raise their hand and make comments or questions. Aria, please.
Hi, yes, thank you. I just chimed in for the end of this, and I'm sorry I missed the notification that it was starting at 4 until just recently. But I'm just curious in terms of what you're doing to figure out the messaging. You know, I certainly have an understanding within my environmental groups, the concept of geoengineering tends to be frowned upon quite a bit, and yet there are other terms that can be used to help bring people on board to have a better understanding. And so I just kind of wanted to open that up for your thoughts in terms of, you know, local cooling, planetary brightening, ocean repair, you know, climate repair, I think, you know, sounds better. But just in terms of if you guys are brainstorming about outreach and really bridging that gap with the general public, if you guys have been testing other framing around this issue that might have a bit more of an opening to get past preconceived notions.
So that's a really good question, Aria. So there are two things. I think we're still very much in listening and learning mode, even though we've been up for 2 years. Hence the research on, we're not intervening on geoengineering isn't a term that we typically use. What we do is, if somebody else uses it, we obviously have to respond, but we don't typically sort of go on the front foot saying it's geoengineering. However, we are really interested right now at getting a better understanding of different voices and different people's views of even that term. There will be others. We have, as you indicated, adopted the term for our own work here of climate repair, and thus far we haven't been chastised and had negative reactions to that. But that doesn't mean to say that we won't, Aria, because the narrative is really important. But I think right now, with any engagement, it's about listening is so important, rather than trying to preach. And yes, we use the term climate repair. Dave uses the term marine biomass regeneration as a framing for that which has gone down better than some of the other terms being used. But we are very wanting to tread very carefully and gently in this space in terms of engagement.
I would love to add that I was really heartened at the response I got. I did have a roundtable with several people in the group, and there are people that are in my networks that are extremely progressive, very into eco-justice and all of that, who would really balk at the concept of geoengineering, who happen to respond really well to the message of planetary brightening. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. I know that that doesn't necessarily encompass the entire breadth of all of the work that's being done, but I would just want to volunteer that for consideration. I was really happy to see how open some people were to some of the framing that I know they wouldn't respond well to the concept of geoengineering. So just food for thought, that's all. And thank you so much for everything you're doing. It really is wonderful to hear. And of course, we've got people on the group who, Peter with his iron, with the work ocean. I'm afraid I'm not using the term properly, probably, but in terms of introducing iron to I think it's iron flakes or whatever. And then Stephen Salter with his marine cloud brightening work. I am very glad to have you connect with them.
Let's move on to the next question, and unless
Sure.
Shaun may wish to say more, but I'll pass on to John. Pass on to John this.
Yes, hello. Thanks very much for your talk. You put it all in perspective. I was very surprised that somewhere around 50% of people are pro geoengineering. One knows all about the people who are against it, and there are a few people who are neutral, but I was really surprised about that. We must definitely work on that 50% to make it go up.
John, I was very surprised too, which is why I would like to get this out in a published, rather than just being a white paper, but in a peer-reviewed journal, which is where we're on. I was really surprised at that too.
Yeah, so I am absolutely enthusiastic about refreezing the Arctic, but there did seem to be two main problems. Groups of people against it. It's the people who are against the stratospheric aerosol injection, which is probably the most powerful means of doing it. And we do know that we're pretty confident it would work, because we can mimic what volcanoes do very successfully. And we can inject north of 60 degrees north and south of 60 degrees south cool both poles by about 2 degrees, according to a recent paper study. I've tried to find what the snags are, and I haven't found any, to be honest. I have looked hard. I've answered all the questions people have asked about it.
So, John, what's your question?
So I'm disappointed you haven't looked at stratospheric aerosol injection.
Oh, sorry, John. I did say the first thing we're looking at is marine cloud brightening. Sorry, we do have a researcher who I should have included is looking at stratospheric aerosol injection. What they're doing to start with is looking at historical records of cluster volcanoes. So this is the plan. It's not, he's going to be recruiting for this fairly soon, but a postdoc to look at this and looking back in time, what the impact on the climate was, not just at one volcano, John, but actually cluster volcanoes. So yeah, we're not dismissing this at all, John, in terms of it being an area that needs more work.
I said there was another big block on refreezing the Arctic, and that is the US government and the fossil fuel companies and the mineral extraction companies who want to exploit the Arctic. And there are people as well who want to have sea routes across the Arctic. So they are against us, and they've got a huge amount of money against us. They've hijacked the IPCC, I'm afraid.
So John, I'm aware of this. What's your John? I'm just mindful of others with their hands up. What's your question?
So, have you got any ideas of how to deal with this huge lobby against refreezing the Arctic?
So I think, as I mentioned to Aria, I think we're in listening mode right now, and I think if we go and get actually a better understanding, not just of that very vocal minority of lobbyists, but a better understanding of the silent majority about these sorts of techniques, I think that will be extremely powerful. So that's the stance where we're starting with, John.
Okay,
thanks, Shaun. Let's move on to Herb Simmons.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Shaun, for your really thoughtful and interesting presentation today. First, I think most of us who are HPAC members know that we're officially agnostic as to technique. We're basically saying everything that could make a significant difference should be urgently and objectively and comprehensively evaluated. That being said, and maybe this sort of follows on the last question or two, but I wonder if you could, we're sort of struggling with how do you tackle the institutional landscape to get the appropriate approaches implemented? Is it the IPCC? Is it COP? Is it G20? Is it G7? Is it the UN, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm wondering whether, at least implicitly or explicitly, whether you have sort of tackled that issue, or whether you hope to commission any research on kind of a policy strategy, if you will.
Well, the first thing, Herb, is that the areas that we're looking at, everything I've spoken about today, whether it's marine cloud brightening, kelp, greenhouse, methane, or marine biomass regeneration, we're not in a position to be talking about deployment of any of those right now. All right, we're absolutely at the research stage, because I think they all have significant potential. All right, but as many of you will be aware, even doing outdoor experiments in some of these instances, all right, is a challenge. All right, so I'm going to hypothesize that doing outdoor experiments with a coating, all right, which knocks out methane, a solid coating on a building that also does self-cleaning glass, I'm going to hypothesize that that's going to be a little easier than it would be to, let's say, go and do John's idea of, I want to go and test some stratospheric aerosol injection, right? But so we are at the moment, they are all at the research stage, and I've got different barriers that we need to to be looking at in order to progress to doing outdoor experiments. And some of these projects will be easier than others, but it's it's working with people, local communities, broader stakeholders, and the experience in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef and the Southern Cross University on doing marine cloud brightening. That was, that's the kind of concept, at least, that's being promoted, whether it is marine cloud brightening, whether it's actually just creating fog. But the whole idea that they've been engaging with the local community for 10 years, and they've got really ground level support, groundswell support for that work, is just, I think, a fantastic example of how to go and actually build real support. No one's going to stop that now, because they've got the local communities wanted to go and do it for the benefit of the local community. And I think there are lessons learned for us all in how you from community areas like this, as to how we go and enlist the right support.
We've had a comment just saying how good your slides were, Shaun, and I hope you'll be able to circulate those, and it would be good if we could put your slide deck up on the Healthy Planet Action Coalition.
I'd be happy for that, Robert. I didn't. That's a very lovely thing that somebody said in the chat. I haven't read it. But I must say I didn't think they were particularly good myself, but one is always self-critical.
Thanks, Shaun. Sev Clark.
Yeah, I have a very quick suggestion and question. First of all, as you are no longer blowing your trumpet, does that mean we should blow it for you?
No. I just don't happen to be playing on Christmas Day this year. I was very busy over the weekend, playing in Ely Cathedral on Friday night, and then in another couple of concerts on Sunday. So no, don't worry, Sev, I haven't packed up the trumpet.
Great. The second is a real question, which is, are you looking at the iron salt aerosol method of reducing methane?
We're not at the moment, but I am I have spoken about this with colleagues in Cambridge, and I know others are, Seb. So actually, in terms of the areas of work that we want to pursue research, is that I mentioned we are part of a big ecosystem. There are others looking at iron salt aerosols, and therefore it makes sense for us also to look at areas that are underserved in terms of research. So the areas that we're picking are those which we think have got significant potential and are underserved in research, and that we've got the capabilities to be able to deliver that. But so a bit like John's question, it isn't, we're not doing work right now on delivery mechanisms for stratospheric aerosol injection or modeling of stratospheric aerosol injection. There are lots of people doing modeling of stratospheric aerosol injection, but there are fewer people looking at some of the aspects of marine cloud brightening that we're looking at. So that's why we're focusing on. It's not because we're dismissing these other areas, Sev.
Fine.
Sorry, Leslie.
Yes, sure. Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your talk. I got tied up working on another project. Darn it. So I hope those slides will come around too. One thing that I'm involved in, and I hope that, and I'm not sure you would be in the UK, is the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, has been having its annual fall meeting, and they've been having panel discussions. I've been lucky enough to be on that panel of what should AGU's position be on doing these small research scale tests that are so desperately needed to figure out, what will work, what won't. And I'm one of the people who really is speaking out about localized climate interventions that will do some immediate good for communities. So we're working on glacial ice. We're planning a test in the Himalayas in this coming year, in deep collaboration with people there. And I think I have learned, I think that's probably the right way to go. But there seems to be a lot of support for that sort of aspect of things. So there's a position paper out there that AGU members can comment on till January 9th, but I'm happy to funnel comments in there too, if anybody wants to look at this, Danielle Visione publicized that to this HPAC group, but things seem to be, people seem to be understanding. There was also this town hall gathering where the speakers, I attended virtually, so I just got to listen, but that's good. Speakers were really articulating the moral hazard these days is to pretend that the decarbonization is going to be in time while it shows no signs of having happened yet, to any extent that will actually be helpful in the terms that we need. And the moral hazard then becomes not, you know, doing some intervention rather than decarbonizing, but believing that decarbonizing alone will do it and ignoring these other options. So I'm seeing this real change in attitude that I think may be helpful. And there's a real distinction AGU is making between these tiny tests, even if they're outside in the field, tiny tests. You know, people were on the panel saying something like, it's silly to think that that's actually going to be a harm to anybody, you know, these tiny things. But the communication, as you pointed out, is absolutely key. Anyway, I just wanted to surface and make sure that across the pond, we were speaking with each other and knowing that, you know, these various efforts are going on. I don't know if you have a parallel thing going on in the UK. It's encouraging.
So I've got two colleagues, Hugh Hunt and Elizabeth Baltas, who are in AGU this week, Leslie.
Oh,
and I think Hugh may have attended, you know, I spoke with him earlier, the panel debates on some of these sorts of things. Wake Smith was on one of the panels, I think.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah. So you know, Hugh was there and in representing us.
So sorry to have taken your time then, but I'm excited this is happening.
Yeah.
Thanks, Leslie. Let's move on to Daphne Wisham.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. Great to get that summary of all the activity. I had a few questions. One, I'll just list the questions and allow you to respond. I wasn't clear on what the Grantham funding was going towards. If you could explain that. I wanted to ask whether or not Indigenous peoples, especially in the Arctic, have been engaged in your refreezing the Arctic concept, just as a non-technical, non-scientist person. I'm wondering, you know, given that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster and the water is warming that much faster, how much energy would be required to continually take this ice and put it on top of more ice with the waters warming so rapidly? In terms of the whaling, the whale issue, and of course you have to take on the whaling industry, this seems to me to be a logical place where NGO allies would be absolutely critical. And I don't know what your civil society engagement strategy is, but that would be, to me, a win-win. And then finally, I think on this list, we've been talking about James Hansen's latest paper in the 10 degrees Celsius of climate forcing that's in the pipeline. I thought he phrased his description of what's been underway since the Industrial Revolution quite well, and saying we've been inadvertently geoengineering, and what we need to do now is remove all of that inadvertent geoengineering from the atmosphere. I think you get into a very different territory when you start talking about adding aerosols at the stratospheric level. But those are my feelings.
So if I can remember those, Daphne, I wasn't taking notes. So look, Grantham Foundation, they are providing some money to allow us to do some lab experiments, primarily on horizon scanning of different catalysts. I'd originally thought of it as photocatalysts, but it's not. It's looking at different catalysts for the oxidation of methane, and in particular, looking, as I said, looking at different tweaks to potential photocatalysts, which could mean, for example, adding metal nanoparticles, but it isn't the only thing that we're looking at. So this is what the team in Cambridge and Gran Canaria are looking at. So looking at different ways of getting whatever the energy source is, whether it's electric charge or whether it's photons to go and sort of provide basically the energy for the catalyst to then work. So they're doing is in large part to do with some laboratory experiments and then working with industry as well over the 2-year period. The second one on Arctic, we're not out in the field at the moment at all, Daphne, but we are beginning to talk with sort of the right it's the right organizations to go and engage with communities. So what I've learned is, and actually even on another project, this is to do with emissions reduction in the much closer to home, in the fens around Cambridge. If you want to go and work with the local communities, don't go to the local communities, all right? It's figuring out who are the trusted agents who those local communities already work with. So going through intermediaries because the trust takes so long to build up. So we thinking very, very carefully about who are the bodies within the Arctic community. So we're at that stage of the planning at the moment, Daphne, rather than saying, right, we're going to go and talk to these people. Sometimes scientists going and talking to these people is the worst thing to go and do. So just learning about actually how do you go and engage with the communities, who are the trusted community representatives. So working, I mean, Leslie will know, actually working in the Himalayas, doing this, thinking very carefully about it. So that's where we are on that project, in the Arctic Circle and other communities too. On the, you're right about the oceans, Daphne, in terms of the NGOs actually potentially being some, how do you go and regenerate those? It's interestingly, the world of offshore kelp with rafts, framing wise, might be easier than, for example, trying to sort of stimulate growth of biomass in the deep ocean with the addition of rice husks imbued with minerals and ocean iron fertilization and things like this. Even though the latter one is what you're trying to do is to regenerate and get an ecosystem closer to what it was in the past, whereas growing kelp in the surface waters of the deep ocean on rafts is actually not a natural thing. But actually, weirdly, that's possibly an easier sort of project to go with. So we're very much in the exploratory phase of working with local. The really key thing is working with the communities, but even with the oceans and the NGO, is working out who do you go through, and are they the right people to actually go and do the engagement and run the projects rather than it being boffins from Cambridge. We have to know our place in society, and it isn't actually the be all or the end all. We're not the ones who know everything. We just know about the science, okay? And it's just making sure that we're sufficiently humble that we can sort of go and allow these field experiments to go, and it might be actually having others run them. So it's really, really important that we understand our role and how the rest of society views scientists. And what was your last one? Sorry, Daphne.
Yeah, well, it was on the whaling thing, and just thinking through the win-win opportunities as sort of the low-hanging fruit in all of this. And it seems to me that there's that whales are beloved by just about every environmental organization, and figuring out a way to work with those currents to get it.
Yeah, so that and it's the way, but the intervention being considered to try and regenerate these is non-trivial. So it's a long conversation, all right, and it's one that needs to be had very sensitively as to whether this is going to be acceptable.
Yeah, and just in terms of the James Hansen thing, I think he was making a distinction between removing versus adding.
That's right, and that's very different. So, but it's not. But it's also what you're adding is also really, I think, is really important. So this is where the difference between, frankly, adding more sea spray through marine cloud brightening versus adding sulfate aerosols to the stratosphere. The reaction to those are very different, even though arguably both are very natural. One is just the wind blowing over over the surface of the ocean, and the other one's called a volcano. And people don't mind the wind blowing over the surface of the ocean as they think volcanoes are nasty. So there is a whole framing and narrative that we have to sort of factor in.
Thanks, Daphne. Mike McCracken.
Hi, Shaun. I have two questions. One has to do with marine cloud brightening and whether you're looking at whether the change in SO2 emissions in the late 20th century as people were controlling SO2 might have led to less brightening of Arctic clouds and accelerated sea ice melting. So it's really seeing if there's some sort of analog condition to marine cloud brightening that you can look at, and might the cutting of SO2 emissions in North America and the US, North America and Europe have affected cloud brightening in the Arctic. I'm not sure there's data to do it, but it'd be an interesting. There has been one modeling study that sort of showed that might be the case. And then the second question is whether you're in this issue of talking to the public about it, whether you're doing any research on how people react to thinking about relative risks of not doing anything versus doing anything. Not just the issue of exactly how one, how well we understand and what the uncertainties are of intervention. I mean, I would argue that I think it's worth arguing that the uncertainties are greater when you're not doing it than they are when you're doing it, because doing, for example, stratospheric aerosol injection keeps the climate in the range that we're sort of used to having studied, whereas not doing it, we're headed to what could be just dramatic change and keeps surprising us anyway. But I'm wondering, and would think in a university environment such as you have, that looking at this issue of relative risk and how you evaluate it and how you communicate it would be an interesting one.
So thank you for that, Mike. So look, there are others that have looked at the SO2 issue, and actually it's an ongoing issue as we move away from fossil fuels. So it's something that it's going to be a pain because the level of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere will decrease, and therefore there will be a warming effect as a result of in the near term. All right.
Well,
so
I guess cleaning up marine emissions or marine fuels is another sort of reduction of sulfur.
Absolutely. So we're just aware that others are looking at that, Mike. It's not something we're looking at specifically right now in the Centre for Climate Repair, but no, we're following that closely. And the other point. So your other point, sorry, Mike.
Relative risk and uncertainties.
So the relative, yeah. So it's something I care greatly about. Is that we're at the moment. The social science work that we've done isn't looking at surveys and questioning people. We're passive listeners at the moment about discourse, it's only the start though, because actually I think this whole issue about getting people to think and getting people's understanding of what they think are relative risks is really, really important. But we're not there yet, Mike. It is an area that we're looking at. And it's something that I bark on quite a lot about, that you can't compare, for example, an intervention today with the climate as it is today. All right, it's an intervention that was going to affect the climate, let's say, over the next 5 years, compared with what's going to happen to the climate over the next 5 years, or whatever that time period is. And and I think that's really, really important. I have not seen enough in terms of the way that it's framed in articles that I typically read in the general public arena. So I couldn't agree with you more strongly that there's a need for that kind of research to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that with the uncertainties about what the future might be, the world has agreed we've got to get rid of fossil fuels completely, which is a tremendous action. And yet they are then concerned about what might happen if you try and imitate a volcano, and that is somehow a much more serious uncertainty to consider. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Robert, Chris?
Good evening, Shaun. Two things, just picking up quickly on Mike's last comments. In Cambridge, you have as a neighbour a brilliant communicator on statistics and risk in David Spiegelhalter. Do you know what his position is on climate change generally, and whether he's somebody that could be joined into the whole process? That's question number one. Oh,
so I don't know his position, Robert, but I do know David. He's actually retired now and is scaling down very much his act. And in fact, his group, the Winton group, is closing down literally this month. So he had another lady called Alex who was working very closely with him. And I worked with them a lot during COVID.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, that's brilliant news if he's retiring, because that means he'll have loads of time on his hands to devote to this whole sphere of activity. I'll leave that one with you. But the main comment I wanted to make was you used a word which just triggered something in the back of my mind. It was nozzle. And you were talking about the design of the nozzles for the dispersion of aerosols of different sorts. And I just wondered whether you were familiar with the work of Steve Jones at UCL. Steve Jones, for those of you who don't know, he's a now emeritus professor of genetics at University College London. And he, another great communicator. And I put in the chat a link to a 3-minute YouTube clip of him explaining how, as a young man, when he was working for Unilever, and they were trying to design a nozzle to improve the production of detergents, that we use for our washing. And he was explaining that the mathematicians who were working, the fluid dynamicists, the mathematics was too complicated for them. They simply couldn't work out how to design a nozzle with the right characteristics to make this task work. So he fell back on the tried and tested mechanisms of evolution, and used random mutation to come up with a nozzle that they couldn't improve on. They had no idea how it worked, why it worked. All they knew is that it did a fantastic job. And if you've got 3 minutes, look at the clip, and it might give you some thoughts about how to move that forward for yourselves. Or maybe somebody there's already doing that, I don't know. But it was just a neat little trick that they used.
Thanks, Robert. So, Shaun, did you want to respond, or will we move on to Suzanne?
I've got a funny feeling Shaun might have frozen there. Is Shaun still there? I think he glazed over as I was talking. I have that effect on him sometimes. I think he's gone.
Yes, we've lost Shaun.
We wore him out.
Actually, me.
You didn't want to answer your question, Robert.
Well, what can I say? I'm sorry, folks. It was unintentional.
Well,
I didn't realise I had that power.
Let's hope that Shaun will come back shortly. So, but
what I'll do is I'll just go and telephone him and see what's going on.
Let me just say again for anybody that came on late, if you're new to our organization and our meetings and you put your email in the chat, I will add you to our Google group so you receive future notifications.
Shaun's back with us, and Shaun, did you want to respond to Robert, Chris?
No, that's fine. Sorry, my power left. my laptop, I wasn't plugged in and it didn't give me a warning. So I'm going to need to run very shortly though, Robert. I'm really sorry.
Thanks, Shaun. We might have 5 minutes or so then.
Yeah,
Is that
five,
okay?
5 minutes and then I've got to run. I'm sorry.
Great. All right. Well, a question from Suzanne.
Yes, Shaun, one of my frustrations is that esteemed people like Sir David King and James Hansen have been talking about climate change, and that now more and more vocally that we are running out of time. And I know you're in a listening and a research mode, but what's your perception of how you penetrate sort of the inertia at the top of the public policy leadership globally to really understand that we don't have that much time left to make decisions about deploying solutions that encompass things like geoengineering and the various methods of greenhouse gas emissions removal?
So look, my perspective is this, is that I can't advocate deployment of stratospheric aerosol injection today, or, because, there are two things. The first, the most important is that I think there's a bit more work that needs to be done. Stratospheric aerosol injection, for example, do I know how to go and deliver the stuff? Right, so we've just got to go and figure out, go and test the delivery first, just make sure it's there, and then we can go and. So with marine cloud brightening, we've got to go and really figure out droplet generation in an energy efficient way that we basically don't have nuclear powered vessels being needed to go and do all of this stuff. So what can we do? So
well, we agree with your research approach, but the question is, when are public policy people going to realize that they need to support and encourage this research?
Suzanne, let me finish. So where we are is engaging with the with those who basically determine the you call it federal in the US, but basically government research money for things like marine cloud brightening or stratospheric aerosol injection. So in the last few months, the UK government has, as part of its equivalent to DARPA, they've set up ARIA in the UK, and they're now in the mode of soliciting roundtable discussions on big, hairy, audacious goal research projects that are in the too difficult to do, too controversial to do, and they're limited to about 10 people, and they've decided which topics they wanted to go and hear from academics in. And I participated in one of these 2 weeks ago that Cambridge had submitted on solar radiation management, right? And so this is, we made it really clear it involved people from University of Washington, people from Germany, around the world, saying that this is needed at pace to go and do research in this. Secondly, somebody like the UK government funding this, right, is catalytic, because it means that, for example, it's not just the money, it's to do with the credentials associated with it. The UK government thinks that this is important, then leverages the funding from philanthropists and trusts and foundations. Furthermore, if the UK government does a bit, it will hopefully nudge other governments, such as the US, where you had the NAS report calling for $100 million a year in this kind of area. If the UK government can throw some money at this, it will hopefully therefore have a knock-on effect, actually being for the US as well. So there are leverage features to our conversations with the funding agencies. So I've made zero progress with people like the BEIs in the UK. Interestingly, the conventional research councils are beginning to look at this. Well, that's been rather interesting for me. But the fact that ARIA is actually seemingly very interested in this is even more exciting. That, for me, is how you then get the traction with the policymakers about, right, well, if this is happening, thinking about what might happen in 5 years' time, if ever the deployment then became something they need to think about. But the way to get to them is through their own funding bodies, is my view.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shaun. Do you have time for one final question?
One final question that I need to run.
Herb.
Yes, I'll make it quick and to the point. HPAC has as our sort of DNA to use the triad of approaches as you do, but with the goal of getting temperature increases to well below 1 degree C. I don't see anything about the sort of what the ultimate goal of this work on your website. Do you have a similar goal? Restoration, reducing temperatures? What's the ultimate goal if you achieve everything you want?
So, Herbert, taking a leaf out of somebody else's book, actually a greenhouse gas level of 350 parts per million, which I think gets us to around a similar temperature mark as to that you've suggested, Herb, as being something that is habitable. But in the journey there, we just don't want to lose Greenland, the Arctic, and Antarctic ice.
Is that articulated on your website, that 350?
I thought it was, and if it's not,
Okay.
then then I need to revisit that. So we certainly use it on slides, Herb.
Okay, that's great to hear. I'll turn it back to Robert.
So on behalf of everyone, I'd just like to thank you very deeply, Shaun, for taking the time to update us on the work of the Centre.
Thank you, Doug, by the way.
At Cambridge. And I think it's been a very illuminating conversation and information sharing. I'm very glad we've been able to have the exchange. And as mentioned, your slide presentation was very useful. We look forward to putting the recording out there, and
that's good.
We'll do that shortly. And so thanks very much, Shaun, and we'll conclude at that point.
Thanks ever so much indeed, everybody, for your time.
Steering circle members, if you could stay on for a few minutes. And thanks again, Shaun.
Thank you. That was wonderful.